All right. Good morning. Good morning. All right. So we are in the last unit of class, which is exciting. And this is the last week of class, which is, it's kind of sad. But most of you are going like, no, it's really not. Here's some things I would like to mention to you, okay? Thing number one, if you're turning stuff in about a week late, would you at least tell me why? This is not my message to the person who told me why, and I forgot that you told me why, because you told me why after class. That was like 100% my fault. So, but yeah, there are like four of you that hadn't turned anything in for a couple weeks and then turned a bunch of stuff in this weekend. So, if you don't mind sending me a little email that says, even if it just says I got behind at work or didn't realize stuff was done, that'll help me, especially if it's the quiz, yeah. Because I think one of you turned in a quiz a couple weeks late. Yeah, at least tell me why, if you would. You don't have to tell me all your life details, but just a general thing. So I'll know. No. Also, if you're one of those folks, well, all of you anyway, my grades are due pretty quickly after class ends. I don't mean like they're due Saturday, but they're typically due Tuesday after class ends. So all your stuff's due Friday, the Unit 4 stuff. And I made an error, and I'm so sorry about that as well, that one of the Unit 4 questions, I think on the actual due date within the assignment, it had the right date, but on the title, it had the wrong date. So I can see why that was disturbing to you, and I'm sorry about that. I did go back in and fix it, and I appreciate you letting me know, because I really do want to know when I mess stuff up. So um, hopefully that didn't cause you stress. If you turned that in early because you got nervous and you thought, oh my gosh, I don't want to turn that in late, and you want to redo it, feel free. Yeah, just, hopefully you saved a copy, but you can resubmit if, excuse me for yawning at you, if you want to spend more time on it. If some of you are like, no, I'm glad I got it done, that's fine too. Um, Most of you still doing a pretty nice job on your work. Some of you are still doing a pretty sparse job on your work. So a couple things that I really do expect on the answers to your questions. One, specific examples. And two, use the textbook. There are a couple of you that I'm pretty sure not using the textbook at all. And there's a reason that I want you to use the textbook, because it's a fairly proven resource. We know who the author is, and he has a historical reputation that's quite good, to be fair. It's a fairly well written textbook. I know you're going like textbook. It's a fairly thorough textbook, but it's also a fairly concise textbook. I think it's a good source. Give it a try. That's what I would suggest to you. Give it a try. All right. So on these last questions, those of you that I keep saying you really should use your textbook, use your textbook. Yeah, throw me a bone here. Make it easier for me to grade. It's easier, then you get more points, which is always good, right? Okay, but again, if you came in a little late, I promise, I will finish grading your stuff today. It was just too many things to do this week. Some of them were fun, not all of them. All right, and too much work last week, so sorry about that. All right, yeah. All right, I moved you guys from the screen. I didn't mean to. Did I just share some weird thing with you? Let me go back to your page. Poop. This is definitely not the right page. Oh, I did share a weird page with you. Let me open the right page. All right. So we are going over, the good news is there's so much good news today. There's only 3 chapters, 13, 14, and 15. They mostly have to do, 13 it's really a complete chapter about slavery. 14 is about the Civil War, and 15 is about Reconstruction. How did things go after the Civil War? And I think you'll be impressed that some things went surprisingly well after the Civil War. And then I think you're also probably expecting some things did not go well after the Civil War, and you would be correct about that. So, yeah, you're going to read some stuff that will make you unhappy, and you'll read some stuff, hopefully, that'll make you happy. All right. Let me see if I opened these things. Okay. It looks promising. All right. Notes. And I don't want you to see that. Yep, you can see that. Okay. It's not a state secret. I was keeping track of some of the copies of work that you did. Oh, goodness. Yeah, and I was reading through, so I started reading through, to be honest with you, when I started reading the document analysis questions, I just kept reading them and I just looked at them and I went, oh gosh, I really don't like any of these. I'm sure it had nothing to do with you, honestly. I think I was just really tired, so I didn't grade them. But I did grade a couple, but it kind of led me to the conclusion that I might not ever again ask a document question that has very much to do with the Bible. Because, I kind of wanted you to answer, just the general document questions. I got like 5 or 6 sermons. It's like, wow, that's a lot of sermons for answers on a history question. So, but I get it. I mean, when we talk about your religion, you get excited about it, which is natural. So, like, you got to remember to answer the history question too. All right. Here are your questions for this week. Oh, the Free Soil Party. That's one of the craziest things, I think, from this era, which clearly is probably why I asked you the question about it. So we'll talk about that today as we look over chapter 13. For chapter 14, basic premise of the Confederate government, advantages did the Confederacy have, and why did the leaders of the Confederacy think they would win? It did have something to do with Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, but there were other things as well, defensive war kind of stuff. And yeah, if you answer that one, you also want to talk about their founding documents, what the Confederate Constitution sort of looked like, just generally. I mean, I don't expect you to go look up the Confederate Constitution. And number 15 is Reconstruction a success or a failure? And that is a complex question. Usually when you get a question like that, the answer is yes. It's probably both a success and a failure. So yeah, that can be tricky. And we'll talk quite a bit about that, as you might imagine. Yeah, there are going to be some great things about Reconstruction, which is the period after the Civil War where they're reconstructing the Union, putting the North and the South back together into one singular country. So they'll do some things surprisingly well, and they'll do some things surprisingly poorly. I think when you, or maybe not surprisingly poorly, I think when you start off with the idea that the guy who's in charge initially in Reconstruction, Lincoln got assassinated. I hate to spoil that if you didn't know. His vice president was Andrew Johnson, who was a Southerner who thought everyone should own a slave. That is probably not the right guy to be in charge after the Civil War, but we'll talk also about why he picked him. It seems like an odd choice. It kind of was an odd choice. He had good reasons, but it works as long as Lincoln is actually president, and of course he wasn't. So that was the problem. All right. So our question, free soil, will cover that, I promise. All right, document assignment. I think some of you have already done it. Guys are, some of you are really on top of stuff. You're ahead. This one is my favorite speech, Lincoln's second inaugural address. And then I know it has some biblical allusions in there, so try not to write a sermon for me. But a little, I mean, you can write a little sermon. That's all right, little sermon. But don't forget to answer all the rest of the questions about who the author was. Oh, let's talk about credibility. Yeah, question number 3. I clearly have not done a great job of talking about credibility because you, in your answers, are telling me things like, well, I didn't believe him, so I don't think the source was credible. I get why you're saying that. I mean, I'm not blaming you. I'm blaming me. Um, I'm thinking that it's possible that I didn't do a good job explaining credibility, or you're just unaware of it. So either way, we got to fix that. So whether a source is credible or not kind of goes along with the idea of reliability. So, do we believe that the source is an accurate depiction of what the author is saying, is intending? So, here's a source that I'm aware of that was not a credible source from my own life. I taught high school for a very long time, and there was one year that we decided we would do an audio recording of all the AP advanced placement review sessions that we had. So I had a student who wasn't particularly fond of me that took those recordings and spliced them together and then put them out on the internet. And it had me in my own voice saying some fairly inappropriate things. That was not a credible source because someone had altered the content of the source. See what I'm saying? So when I'm asking about credibility, uh, in part, we're asking, do you think that's an authentic representation of what the author was trying to convey? And then you can also talk about whether or not, you know, if you don't believe it was credible, do you think it was not credible because someone altered the source or because the source itself was being dishonest? Like, I don't know, if somebody gave a big talk about how I was a great student athlete, um, they may have really said that. It'd be kind of dumb, because I was not a great student athlete. I did play some sports in high school, but I was terrible. Um, but you would want to then try to decide why the person was being less than honest. Maybe they're trying to be nice, maybe they were trying to be dishonest, that sort of thing. So the credible part is like, I think it was tricky on that it was kind of bad. I think it was tricky on that last one because there were a lot of you who said, I just think there's no way that any of this stuff is true, that the Bible is really, and Christianity should be promoting slavery. And I get that. Yeah, I get why you don't think, yeah, no, I completely get that. That wasn't exactly what I was asking, but I'm not going to give you a hard time about that because I get why you said that. And I probably didn't give you a very good explanation. So I'll go back and look, sort of. But yeah, credibility it's not just do you believe what they're saying, like, do you believe that the Bible defends slavery? Um, but you could also have talked about if you believe that he really believed that. Certainly Southerners said that very consistently. And I often wonder too, did they really believe that? Or did they just say that because it's what they felt like they needed to say? I don't know if we have a good answer. There may be some diaries somewhere where somebody says, man, that's just a whole load of poop, but I have to defend my actions. So, I don't know. I think adults say a whole load of poop. All right, and then we'll look at notes. We'll start talking about the chapter. Let's do that. That'll be good. I feel like I'm really in slow motion today, so I'm sorry. Just so tired. I blame the AP grading, but also my nephew came in Friday, and then the last 2 days were so busy. Goodness. All right, but today, all about grading and maybe taking a nap before I do it. All right. So, this is curious that I made my notes this way. But we'll go with it. Yeah. Let me scroll down just a minute. Yeah, this would probably work. We definitely need to talk about the Free Soil Party. Let me slide the book over. I do use the book while I grade. I'm sure you're not surprised by that. I probably use the book more than several of you, which I don't know, I find fascinating. Use the book. It's pretty a good textbook, really. Owner's a good historian. Yeah. All right. You're going like, yeah, I don't care. You should care. I don't know if you should care. No, I was interested, I enjoy reading your answers. I do. And, I noticed a lot of you talking about um, defense of slavery, that sort of stuff, and how it's really surprising to you that people would be willing to go that far to defend slavery. Or, several of you talked about teachers you had in your past who I know talked about the Civil War and said it wasn't really about slavery. And I know a couple of colleagues who could make an argument. There's nobody at ACC that I know that would do that, but some other places that I've worked who could make a decent argument about that. I wouldn't agree with it, but they could make a decent argument about it. But most people can, So, and I had mentioned in a couple of my responses that when I was a kid, and I grew up in southern Missouri, and Missouri, as you noticed from the Missouri Compromise, has a fairly troubled history. And another sort of odd thing about Missouri, there's a river that goes through the middle. There's also one that goes on the eastern border. There would be the Mississippi River, but the Missouri River flows through about the middle of the state and kind of cuts it in half, north and south. The northern part of Missouri was sure it was a free state and behaved a little more like Iowa politically. And the southern part of the state was convinced it was part of the Confederacy. So I grew up in the southern part of the state and had several very old relatives who still had Confederate flags and talked about, how terrible the Civil War was, which is kind of weird, in the 60s and 70s, like, wow. But they often referred to the War of Northern Aggression or what else would they call the war between the states? But they didn't even necessarily call it the Civil War. And it was not uncommon, to have textbooks, in part because I grew up in a really poor area. So we had really, really old textbooks, probably some of the same ones my parents had. So, and they were probably old when my parents had them. So our textbooks were probably 30 or 40 years old in some instances. But they were very pro-South in their depiction of the Civil War. And if you find really old textbooks, you will find some pretty strong defenses of the Southern position in those textbooks as they cover the Civil War. And one of the things you'll notice too, immediately after the Civil War, people were pretty like, nope, that was about slavery. The South messed up, they lost. That's the way it goes. We got to fix this. But then there'll be a period of revision, and a couple of you talked about, I hate history revisionism. History revisionism is always going on, and some of it probably is good. I know that's good and bad is kind of a hard discussion, but some of it's probably positive because they're incorporating new resources or new perspectives. And I think we typically are okay with that. It's weird how, you might find some new resource from something 100 years ago in somebody's attic or, in a box somewhere that might actually be helpful and shed some new light on some things. And sometimes historians say, like, we really have just gone with the mainstream perspective or the political perspective or the military perspective of this war, this battle, this event. Maybe we should look more at an economic perspective or labor history perspective or the perspective of people who were not prominent, look at people's individual diaries and journals or local newspapers. And sometimes there's an intentional effort to look for minority perspectives. And I don't necessarily mean people of color, but often it is people of color, or maybe it's women, or maybe it's poor people, because even though poor people are not a minority, they're definitely not percentage-wise. Their perspectives on history often are. And there are lots of assumptions that we have about poor people, that they're uneducated, they're uninterested, that sort of thing. And that's not always true, not always true. So yeah, incorporating different perspectives, I think, gives us a fuller version of the history. I know I have the, the old conservative relatives is like, why don't you just teach the true history? It's like, who even, yeah, I don't think anybody's teaching the lie history. It's just that, well, I shouldn't say that. Somebody probably is. But, we're all incorporating different perspectives. So, or, looking at it in a different way. So, no, I don't know. I don't know what I'm talking about. I do know why I'm talking about that because we're talking about the Civil War. And I know I had a big discussion with somebody over the weekend. You know what I had a discussion about critical race theory. It's like, why are you teaching critical race theory? It's like, I'm pretty sure I'm not teaching critical race theory because critical race theory is not necessarily a history program, and it's a way of looking at all sorts of things, and it's not part of a curriculum. I know our state just banned the teaching of that. So did Florida in public schools, which, to be honest with you, nobody was teaching that in public school as far as I know. But I don't know, everything, lots of things are political right now. And I think there's just a group of folks that if you say anything negative about the United States, you're saying it's a horrible country. There's some negative things about every country. And I was telling this person, if you want my perspective on this, my personal opinion, that kind of thing, I don't think the United States is the worst country in history. I think, far from it. I think there are amazing things that have happened in the United States. And we created a system of government that allows us to peacefully improve and change things, through elections and petition and recall and all sorts of cool things that are built into our system so we can make things better. And that if we don't think things are good, then we can publicly protest and, um, find things that we don't think are right. And, people go on trial. Police officers we saw over the weekend, Friday, I guess it was, the Derek Chauvin fellow got his sentence. And, here we have an open enough system that where if there's a person in a position of authority, and I know it doesn't happen all the time and often enough, but part of the reason it happens more often now, people are videoing it, we get to see it, people are protesting it. There's still systems in the world where that no one would have even known that happened, and that would have been taken care of quickly and quietly, and anybody who witnessed it might have gone to jail as well. So, I, again, not defending very many things. Well, I always think of China and North Korea. And, Russia, that's kind of our traditional enemy. And I don't want to be around Putin. I'm not going to lie. I don't think he's a soft, cuddly, kind of warm figure. But yeah, any totalitarian government or oppressive regime that's intentionally repressive, yeah, there are going to be bad things that happen that either just don't get covered at all. I always think of the Uyghur population, excuse me, the Muslim population in China, who are just regularly put in camps and re-educated and sterilized if they don't deny their religion. And we know this is going on, but no one seems to confront China about it, or like, we don't want to buy stuff from you or sell things to you because, economics. And I don't know. All right, why am I talking about that? Let's talk about the chapter. I know why I'm talking about it, but studying your own history and being critical of things, I don't think is being unpatriotic or saying our country's terrible. I think, our country far from perfect. Whose country is perfect? I know my young nephew who's here is like, I don't even think we're in the top 10 of good countries in the world. It's like, I get it from his perspective. I do, I said, well, I think as you get older and study more countries, you'll probably go like, nah, not so bad. in the overall scheme of things, because we're open about fixing things, especially in the modern era. I know we haven't always been. I teach this stuff for a living. But also it's why we study it, so we can look at the era where we weren't as open about change. And also if we know what needed to be changed, Antarctica, yeah, the penguins. And yeah, I do think the colder places sometimes do better. It's not always true, because there's fewer people, but all right. Yeah, we don't want to live in cold places. Yeah, uh, no, because communist country usually is dictatorship. I had one student from Macedonia, and he was very upset with me because, I was, when I teach 1302, I refer to communism as evil, godless communism, because it's how people talked about it in that era. And there were reasons for that. Certainly the United States, goodness, was going through civil rights movement, that sort of stuff. So it's not like the United States had it all together, um, at all. And certainly there are terrible things that happened in our country in that era, probably, more than we would like to talk about. But he said, you always talk about how communist nations are terrible, and you never talk about Macedonia, which really did communism well. And I went, you are correct. Because the truth is, I just don't know much about Macedonia. So he enlightened me a little bit, and it's like, no, you're right, I probably should know a little more about Macedonia. So now every time I talk about communism, I like, except Macedonia. Communism usually had a really horrible dictator kind of dude that killed folks or had people killed who disagreed with him. All right, slavery, let's talk about slavery. All right. Why does slavery become more important in US politics in the 1840s? One of the things Missouri Compromise question that I was hoping you would talk about a little is why that balance of power in the Senate mattered. So you know that the Senate approves cabinet positions, judges, that sort of thing, and their terms are longer. So they serve 6 years while people in the House serve 2. And they tend to serve longer, not just longer terms, but more terms in the Senate. They tend to stay there longer. Plus, you have 2 per state in the Senate. So whether you're Rhode Island or Texas, you have the same representation. So it disproportionately gives power to states with smaller populations. And we probably have mentioned more than once that the North had a much larger population than the South. So in the Senate, if you can keep the balance of slave and free states equal, the South has equal power in the Senate. They're never going to in the Congress, or excuse me, in the House of Representatives. They're never going to, because the North has a larger population. Now, the North especially doesn't want there to be more slave states than free states, because they already think the South has a disproportionate amount of power. If you look at other literature, our book doesn't talk about it so much, but a little, the idea of the slave power, because presidents are going to be, between, who's the last president whose name you would remember? Probably Andrew Jackson, up through Abraham Lincoln. You have a whole bunch of presidents whose names you don't remember. And part of the reason, I'm not, being disrespectful about your knowledge of history, part of the reason you don't know who they are is because they try really hard not to do anything that's going to stir the pot. So you have a whole group of politicians whose whole goal is to make sure no civil war breaks out on their watch. They don't really want to solve problems. They just want to make sure that no new problems emerge. And the balance of power between slave and free states is part of that preservation. But because the presidents are not very bold, the North thinks the South kind of controls the presidents, because their goal is, let's not mess with the situation about slavery. The South, if you look at Supreme Court rulings during this time period, and I was reading an article about some stuff that people don't talk about, John Marshall, because he was a slave owner. He was from that Virginia group as well. And his specifically his thoughts and views on slavery. And I thought, you know what, I really don't know much about that. So I will probably go back and research a little more of that after, not after class today, but after class this summer. Yeah, because yeah, I got to focus more on grading, don't I? I got to finish you guys' work. But the Supreme Court is definitely pro-South. And the structure of Congress really helps the South because of, one, the 3/5 compromise, and two, the way that the balance of power had been maintained in the Senate, that they don't admit a slave state or a free state by itself. So, yeah, the North feels like the South has too much power. The South feels like the North has too much power because they really can't control tariff policy and taxing, and you know, they know that the financial policy of the U.S. government probably benefits manufacturing over agriculture. And since the South doesn't have a very diversified economy, they feel like that's more of a North versus South thing. Kind of is, it's kind of not. So, the North feels like the South has a huge advantage disproportionate to their population. The South feels like the North has an advantage because their economy is larger. They have more pull over the government and more economic power as well. That part is true, the economic power, definitely. Yeah, and of course, both the North and the South want to control the issue of slavery for economic and political reasons. And I'm never going to argue that there aren't some very, very sincere abolitionists. There are. You've read about them. That chapter, the Reform chapter, the section where they talked about abolition, those folks were incredibly committed. And you'll see some politicians. Well, Civil War is a lot about money. I mean, there's no way around that. You'll see some politicians who are very serious about wanting to end slavery because it's wrong, because it's immoral, because it's a sin. So that Theodore Weld idea really caught on. But you'll also see some politicians, the Free Soil Party will be the best example of it. Well, yeah, probably the best example of it. You'll see some politicians who just realize that that position could be good for them politically, which is probably weird and probably not. So, all right. Adding Texas to the Union, why would that be controversial? A couple of reasons. You guys probably know this better than I do if you're from Texas. So, Texas is big. We're all aware of that. And apparently when it joins the Union, it can be divided into 5 separate states. So that could potentially be 5 new slave states. So adding Texas by itself is going to create an imbalance of slave and free. So there'll be 1 more slave state and could potentially add 4 more slave states. And that's also why it took several presidents before they agreed to even entertain the idea of adding Texas as a state. I know Texas had to come to that conclusion that it was a good idea. But once they did, it took a few presidents before they said, no, that seems fine. I think it was Polk. I feel confident it was. Polk was the one who said Texas should come in. I think that was, yeah, Polk. Also, sometimes textbooks like this will talk about how Texas separated from Mexico for a couple of reasons. One, they weren't thrilled about the Spanish-Mexican rule, that 2 in particular. 1, you couldn't own slaves. Lots of people who came to Texas had slaves. And 2, that you had to submit to the Mexican government and be Catholic. And there was some anti-Catholicism involved in that. It's probably not the strongest thing. And then, you know, there's the possibility they just wanted freedom, but, you know, there's lots of possibilities going on in there. Freedom to do what? I don't know. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah,
Real
please.
quick. Now the book said, well, what was the percentage? 3 out of 4 only of the wealthy in the South own slaves?
Oh, yeah, it's such a small percentage in the South that owned slaves. It depends on the time period, but I think when you get to 1860, it's 20%. And then within that group of people, almost all of them, like 95%, own 1 or 2 slaves.
Oh,
Yeah, the percentage of people that own like plantation full of slaves is like 3 to 4% of slave owners, I think. Maybe it's 5, but it's like 2% of 2 to 3% of the full population in the South. Yeah. But I mean, that's a super influential group of folks because they're the ones who run the government. So they make all the rules. And as that one chapter, the one that talked about the unity between the slave owning and non-slave owning whites in the South, there's a socioeconomic unity that goes along with poor whites and rich whites as well. And there's also the thought that if you're a poor white guy, you think, well, someday I'll be a plantation owner. I just won't be as snobby as those guys are.
thank
But
you.
yeah,
That answered my question. I didn't
no,
get it.
you're welcome. Yeah, the math is funny on that. Yeah, I don't know if I'm the best source for math, but the book will, especially when we get to the next chapter, the book I think reminds us of some of those percentages. Sorry for the yawn, but well, and I do think the story of Texas independence is really dramatic and exciting and that sort of stuff. And of course, you defeat Santa Anna, which is amazing and exciting, and seemed like an upset, and it was an upset in some way. So you have Texas independence, and then pretty quickly their desire to join the Union, and it's controversial because it's going to upset the balance and create potentially 4 additional slave states, so 5 total. All right. There's also a really brief discussion of the controversy in Oregon. I think different historians I'm nowhere close to an expert on this at all. We all have to study certain, we have to write a big paper to get at least a master's degree, a thesis. And mine had something to do with civil rights activities in the 1950s. And then my other really intense area of study was the Constitution. I did not study the Oregon border controversy very much. I just know there was one. So the Oregon border controversy, it was just a decision. Did they want which line did they want? The 5440 or a slightly lower area that would give less of the Oregon Territory to the United States? And so there was some discussion about whether or not there would be a war over this. I mostly listened to, was taught by, read historians who thought that was probably not a realistic possibility. I think Foner thinks it was more of a possibility. He's certainly a better historian than I will ever be, so maybe we should trust him. But there wasn't a war. There was a threat of a war. Our battle cry was 5440 or fight, but we didn't fight. The British sent some warships along the Pacific coast of the Oregon Territory, which included Oregon and present-day Washington, where it's going to be like 115 degrees over the next couple of days. Those guys are in so much trouble. Yeah, no air conditioning and stuff. Yeah, it'd be like winter down here when we have it. So good luck to them. But Great Britain sent some warships when we were kind of hinting we would go to war. We didn't really have any warships. And if we did, we surely couldn't get them to the Pacific coast. That was going to be a chore. So we negotiated. And we didn't go with the 5440 line. We went to the more southern line. And we did get some fishing rights off the coast, which we always want. We always want fishing rights off the coast. So that was helpful. So we agreed on the more southern border. All right. California Gold Rush, and then we got to go back to the Mexican War. California Gold Rush brings people to California, which was not heavily populated. So it matters quite a bit because once the gold was discovered, really in 48, and then, you know, people came to California in 49, it causes a huge increase in population, which leads to an application for statehood, which leads to, is California going to be a slave or a free state? Because that 3630 line that's supposed to be like everything below that is slave and everything above that is free, splits California in half. So it creates a really big controversy. So 1848, 49 is what we're talking about here. California grows really, quite literally, exponentially from a few thousand folks to over 2 million within a year. Super fast. I know you think Austin area has grown a lot. It has, but it hadn't grown like that as fast. I realize we're talking whole state here, but this is also an era where transportation's not good. So this is quite an impressive population shift. They applied as a free state, which was problematic because, you know, balance, slave and free states, that sort of thing, but also because some people with slaves already lived in California, which is not typically how we view California as a state that had slavery, but yeah, they did. And if you study this more precisely, most of us really never will, but if you study this more precisely, you'll notice that most slave states, or excuse me, most states in the West were free states, but they're far enough away that a lot of people in those free states, I'm not talking majority by any stretch of the imagination, and it's not even a high percentage like, you know, 5% of the population. It's going to be, you know, you can find 10 people, but there are going to be some people in these states that are slave owners. There are, and no one's going to really enforce the law. It's part of why we have the Dred Scott case. You're going like, what is the Dred Scott case? We'll talk about it later. Because some guy who lived in a free territory was kept as a slave. And the laws protected the idea that if you owned a slave and moved to a free territory, that you still got to keep that person as a slave, which has to seem bizarre. I think it seems bizarre. Okay. All right. So California grows quickly. Not everyone who goes to California to find golds from the United States. Some folks from Mexico, remembering, of course, California was very recently part of Mexico in the 1840s, like a year before that. And some Asian folks, Chinese and Japanese primarily, go there to look for gold. And that will create an interesting future system of segregation in California that typically is not white and black, it's white and Asian or white and Hispanic. Territorial and state laws promptly ban Asians from owning land. And that's going to be a very consistent issue, anti-Asian laws, anti-Asian bias on the West Coast. More than other parts of the country, because the Asian population, because of geography, is going to be larger on the West Coast. And the filing for title, that happens in any former Mexican state. So you may have owned title for your land, you know, from your family for generations, and that title is in Mexico City. When those parts of the Southwest become part of the United States rather than part of Mexico, you're supposed to refile for title with the US government. And if you don't do that, if someone else does it within a certain period of time, then you can lose ownership of the land. And you'll notice that that happens quite a bit during this era, primarily in Texas and California, because more people live there. Other, you know, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada as well. There'll be some Utah, a little southern part of modern Utah. But you'll see that happen in those states as well. Mexican War, we should probably talk about the Mexican War, maybe in a better order than I did. Oh, and I feel a little bad. Hang on one sec as I scroll. The idea of manifest destiny, and that'll be on our, we'll probably look at the list of things that will be on the, excuse me, that'll be on the quiz. We'll look at that list more tomorrow. Somebody's coming in. Let me check them off. The idea of manifest destiny is essentially the idea that God really wanted white people in particular to inhabit the entire United States from sea to shining sea, from east to west coast. And how did we know that that was the case? And there's that very famous manifest destiny angel person going with the wagon trains, page 678 in your textbook. I think it's 678. Yep. How do we know that God wanted us to do that? Because God made it easy for us to do that, for us to take over what had been part of Mexico or what had belonged to Native Americans. So, if it weren't supposed to happen, it wouldn't be so easy. That's an overly simplistic explanation, perhaps, but it mostly works. All right. And they called it Manifest Destiny because of that John O'Sullivan article that talked about how it was the manifest destiny of the peoples of the United States to inhabit the entire continent because of their constantly expanding masses, because our population was increasing rapidly as well. So, and of course, again, in this era, the key to wealth still is land ownership, because there's certainly more people who are rural than urban and are agricultural rather than manufacturing based. All right, scroll back up, sorry. Mexican War. So there's Texas has become part of the United States, but the United States is kind of looking at Texas and other parts of Mexico. I know Texas isn't part of Mexico at this point, 46, but they're looking at it and they're thinking, we'd do better with that land. Mexico's really big. They can't manage all that territory. Mexico City's pretty far away. We'd like some of the stuff there, especially California, the trading routes in New Mexico, and the disputed land in southern Texas between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. So the United States decides to send troops in that disputed area to protect it. And Mexico sees that as an invasion of their land, because technically it is. So the U.S. sends troops there, and Santa Anna and his armies fire at those troops. Santa Anna doesn't do it personally, but the Mexican armies do. And then that's considered an act of war, which leads to a declaration of war from the United States. This is 1848. The Mexican War lasts a couple of years. And the U.S. in this instance is pretty successful from the beginning point of this war. This one wasn't like, I wonder if we'll win or wonder if we won't. The book will talk about, a couple of major generals. Sorry for the yawn. Stephen Kearny. Who else is? Don Tyler? No, that's not who I'm thinking of. It's somebody that becomes a president. Sorry, I'm really tired. Winfield Scott, who runs for president, he doesn't become a president. The Harrison? Is it Benjamin Harrison? I can't remember. All right, but I'll look in a little bit. But it's going to lead to, some fame for some generals, and they'll run for office, that sort of stuff. But it's going to lead to the gain of just a lot of territory. And this is going to be problematic for some northern congressmen. One in particular, congressman who was upset about this was a fellow named Abraham Lincoln, who was just a recent congressman from the state of Illinois. And the concern about the Mexican War is that almost all of that territory is below the 3630 line. So if we go strictly with the 3630 line, we're going to add a ridiculous number of new states that will help out the South, even though I know not very many people live there, except California, pretty quickly. Not very many people live in these territories except Texas and California, but they'll all get 2 seats in the Senate. So whether they have a large population or not, they only need, I think it's 5,000 to apply for statehood and then 50,000 to apply for territorial status. So they don't need to be big. They just need to get incorporated. They just need to file as a state. So the northern states, sorry. So sorry. The northern states are particularly distressed at the potential addition of dozens of new states from that would add to the South. So it's problematic for them, for sure. All right. So Mexican War, the concern really is that it's going to add territory to the South and representation to the South. If you look at the map on what page is that? 483. There's not enough light in here this morning, and I'm getting old. So 483, the map of the territories ceded by Mexico, you can see that it's all in the South. Of course you can see that. But you knew that anyway. You didn't need to see a map. All right. Oh, there's a section about manifest destiny right after the Mexican War. Yeah, and it talks about race and ethnicity and manifest destiny. Yeah, they're very specific when they talk about manifest destiny. They really mean white people. And when John O'Sullivan talks about manifest destiny, he really kind of I don't know that redefine is the right word, but defines race, which is kind of interesting, and how he makes categories of race. I think race as any sort of construct is sort of weird, to be honest, because how do you decide, excuse me, who belongs to what race? And how do you decide what a race is within, the human species or within humankind? It is kind of a weird construct or concept. But I think that they defined race in that era. You had the Anglo-Saxon race, which is that all white people? Is it not white people? How does that work? Because Angles and Saxons were 2 specific ethnicities from a long time ago. I mean, before we even really had countries, and but anyway. And then they talk about racial categories as being Black and Indian, Hispanic, and then maybe Catholic, which I don't know how there's a Catholic race. And I don't think that they meant in the book when they're just, I know that they didn't mean that there's a discussion of Catholics as a race, but when they defined what the Anglo-Saxon race was, their goal in defining it was to exclude Catholics. So it's like, that's so bizarre. So, race from its initial discussions, whether it's and you have to also understand, John O'Sullivan is not the only guy trying to define race during this time period. And you'll see it redefined consistently. So there's not ever, I'm not even sure now that there's a consistent definition of what race is, but in talking about manifest destiny, the goal is to, for Sullivan, is to create a category of people that really is fairly pretty much from a British or Germanic background, because that's where most of the immigrants to the United States have come from during this time period. I know, there were a lot of Irish immigrants, like 3 million, but the population of the United States was much larger than that. So his discussion is going to be primarily that people of a Germanic or English background are the best people, most developed, that sort of thing, people in that era. Oh, also in one of, I think it was somebody's answer, they were talking about Darwinism, social Darwinism, that sort of thing. And it's too early. I just want to say that because Darwin's a little later and his writing's a little later. But I mean, I get the idea. Yeah. So they wouldn't have thought of it that way, but they would have thought of it in a way similar to that. It just wouldn't have been nearly as scientific. Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of you did mention that the science that they used during this time period is pretty weird. Any science of race, I think, is going to be pretty weird. I think that it is. But manifest destiny as a concept it's fairly, I don't know what the right word would be. I don't know that nationalistic is quite it, but we'll go with that. And it certainly has racist intentions and overtones, that sort of thing. All right. When we gained the new land from the Mexican War, this fellow David Wilmot, who is a free soil kind of guy, says, we want all the new territory to be free. And as a free soil guy, I guess we might as well talk about the free soil group. Free soil guys, they end up forming their own party, and David Wilmot is one of his writings and thoughts are part of the foundation of that party. What they want, and I think there's a section, let me scroll again, I'm so sorry. No, we have to talk specifically about the Free Soil Party. No nothings. Huh. All right, we're doing it. We'll do it now. So the idea behind the free soil is that all of that land is kind of the Mexican cession, everything in the West is open for manifest destiny. Again, back to the idea that the United States Sea to Shining Sea is really intended for Anglo-Saxon descendants, white, English, Germanic kind of folks. So the reason that these folks oppose the spread of slavery to the West, and the reason that David Wilmot introduces the Wilmot Proviso, he is definitely not an abolitionist. What he wants is to make sure that none of this new land ever goes to people of color. Now, if you don't allow slavery in the West, people with slaves will not move to the West. So when slavery ends, which it's going to end at some point, because historically it's ending in many countries during this time period. So the writing's on the wall. People know that slavery is going to end. So if you allow a guy with 50 slaves to move to the West, then you have one white family and you have 50 Black folks. And then when those guys become free, they might be able to get land. So you don't want any of that land in the West to be available for non-white people. So the best way to go about that is to prevent the spread of slavery. So if there's no slavery, the assumption is if you're free and Black, you don't have enough money to move out that way, which statistically is probably true, or mostly true, of course. And if there are no slaves that go that way, then the only people going west would be white people. So you want to reserve that land for white people because in your belief system, that's who God intended the land. So Wilmot there's a quote in your textbook from Wilmot where he really denigrates the idea that blacks and whites are equal and that slavery should be ended because slavery is wrong. He's at the very least calls it, I think, sentimentalism, just the idea that blacks and whites would be equal. But his goal is certainly not abolition. His goal is to make sure all of the new land in the West is for white people. So when there's a discussion of the Free Soil Party, which happens, let me see where that happens in your textbook. Oh, yeah, after around the Dred Scott case discussion. So when there's a discussion of the Free Soil Party, what you'll notice is the Free Soil Party, free labor movement, not interested in abolition. Okay, let me go back to what it says in the notes. Part of the reason it says some of the specific stuff in the notes, as I recall, now that I think about it, is probably to be a little helpful on the quiz as well. I think that's part of the reason I'm pointing out certain things in here. So Wilmot proposes that any new territory from the Mexican cession be free of slavery. And I think he proposes this, I think it's in 49. And Congress rejects this idea, but they end up fighting quite a bit. They end up devising the Compromise of 1850, kind of in the same spirit as the Missouri Compromise, but recognizing that the 3630 line isn't going to be the thing that slows down that concern over slave and free states anymore, because if you just go with that line, most of the new territory is beneath that line, south of that line. So that line is no longer going to be effective in putting off conflict, solving the issue. They got to do something different. So they're going to allow California to enter as a free state, and they'll create this one very large bill, omnibus bill, that they want to pass all at once. And that's the great desire of Henry Clay, who's very old by this point, and Stephen Douglas, who's from Nebraska, kind of an up and coming, Nebraska, Illinois. Why did I say Nebraska? Maybe yeah. Well, anyway, I know why I said Nebraska. Yeah. Because he writes the Kansas-Nebraska. So Stephen Douglas from Illinois is kind of a young and up and coming guy on the scene. And he knows by this point that he probably wants to run for president at some point. So, he wants to get involved with a guy like Henry Clay, who's got this national reputation, which is pretty good, as a guy who solves problems and prevents potential Civil War kind of conflicts, like in he helped write the Missouri Compromise. He helped deal with the difficulties over the Tariff of Abominations, Tariff of 1828, and solved it with a compromise tariff. And then here we have him again on the Compromise of 1850. So their initial intention is to create a very large bill that includes California entering as a free state, the slave trade being abolished in DC, not slavery, but the conclusion is during this era, which is kind of fascinating, is that slavery makes the United States look bad in Washington, DC. Because if you go to the capital of what we are billing ourselves as the world's greatest democracy, and then on the weekends, they're having these slave sales where you can buy people out in open markets on the streets of the capital of the greatest democracy in the world, it looks bad. It's bad for PR. So the thought is, you know what, we're not going to abolish slavery in DC, but we'll abolish the slave trade in DC. So you can't have these open sales and markets and that sort of thing. You can keep the slaves you currently have. There are other ways you can get slaves, but open slave markets, no go. The Fugitive Slave Act, which is a federal law that will require people to help return escaped slaves. And then, sorry for the yawn, excuse me. Oh, such a big yawn. Popular sovereignty. And sovereignty just is the idea who makes the rules or who is in charge. So popular sovereignty, the people rule, is kind of a literal interpretation of that. This idea of popular sovereignty is going to be about slavery. So the new territory itself will get to have a vote and will get to decide whether it will be slave or free. So this popular sovereignty is quite specifically about determining whether you'll be a slave or a free state. So the idea of popular sovereignty will say that people in that territory will have an up or down vote on slavery. They get to determine it, rather than a 3630 line or an act of Congress or a decree by the president, that sort of thing. Now, they think, they being Henry Clay and Stephen Douglas, that this list of things has something that appeals to every section of the country, north, south, and west. They don't really, they don't really think of the East as a section yet, because, you know, the East or the West isn't that far west yet. So, and the West is going to side with the North sometimes and sometimes with the South. So there's no East just yet, because, you know, the East is divided into North and South. So the thought is the West is going to like certain things. The North will like certain things. The East will like certain, or the South will like certain things. So they'll look at all of these things and go like, well, I don't like 1, but I do like 3 and 4, and I can live with 2, or I don't, that sort of thing, so that they'll all agree this is a good compromise. We're not in an era where people want a good compromise. They kind of want all or nothing. And so all sections of the country reject this idea of the Compromise of 1850. And then Henry Clay dies, not because they rejected his idea, but because he's old. So then Henry Clay dies, and then Stephen Douglas says, you know what? I'm still going to try to pass this thing through. So he sends it through one piece at a time, and it passes that way. Rather than the whole thing, he passes individual bills that get all of these things accomplished, which is kind of interesting and sort of backs their theory that everybody can live with parts of this, only has to do it, you know, piece by piece. So the Compromise of 1850 does pass. And then Stephen Douglas introduces something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act would let the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, and there's a map of this on 495. So Kansas is kind of an extended version of current Kansas that kind of goes into Colorado a bit. Sorry for the yawn. And then Nebraska is Nebraska plus some Dakotas and, you know, little bits of Idaho and Montana and stuff. You know, nobody lives there, lived there. Still, they're pretty sparse in population. So the thought is that these two territories would choose whether they'll be slave or free. Now, there is no doubt that Nebraska is going to choose no slavery because, one, not very many people live there, and the people who do live there tend to not favor slavery, and 3, there are not a lot of labor-intensive crops that are grown in these areas. And by that, I don't mean that it's not, you know, winter wheat and corn aren't hard to grow. They are. It takes some work. But you don't work on those crops or on those farms 24/7, 365 days a year. There's a shorter growing season. Typically, you plant with corn. There's a section in the middle where you do detasseling and some other stuff. But typically you plant and harvest and then pray for rain. It's a little more complicated than that, but not much more. So you plant, pray for rain, and then hopefully harvest. So you don't need people, you know, retilling the soil, doing lots of stuff to the crop, tending the crop, trimming things, that sort of thing, very much. So you need the labor when you plant and when you harvest, but not in between. So slavery is going to be impractical. Plus a lot of Swedes and Norwegians that moved to that region. That's not their thing. Yeah, they're philosophically tend to be opposed to that. So a lot of free thinking going on in that area of the country for sure. All right. So Nebraska is pretty well settled. Kansas, oh my, Kansas is a problem because next to Kansas is Missouri, which is a slave state. So the people of Missouri are very concerned that if Kansas becomes a free state, then what will happen is the slaves from Missouri will escape to Kansas because it's a free state. Yeah, that is their concern because it's a shared border. So people from Kansas, Nebraska. I'm so sorry for that super ugly yawns today. The people from Missouri don't want Kansas to be a free state. The Congress passes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and on the day when Kansas is supposed to have their, in the era when Kansas is supposed to have their should we be free or should we be slave election, people from Missouri have gone there to prepare for the election and to vote in the election. So illegal immigrants from Missouri go on voting day to vote in the state election to determine whether Kansas would be slave or free. And it turns out that in that version of the election, the majority vote for it to be a slave state. Now, the people who actually kind of operate the government in Kansas know that that is likely an inaccurate assessment of the will of the people from Kansas because most of the people who live there, have territory, title to their property, that sort of stuff, are not slave owners. So they know that that vote was incorrect. So they want to push back on that. And so what you end up with is a civil war in Kansas. You end up with a civil war in Kansas, which is really kind of an odd thing. Sorry for the yawn. Oh my goodness. So sorry. All right, so let's scroll down as I'm yawning and writing somebody's name in that came in. So here's some background stuff. What is the Kansas-Nebraska Act and why did Douglas introduced it? Douglas wanted to run against Lincoln for Senate in Illinois, planned to run for president as a Northern Democrat. He assumed he'd have the support of other Northern Democrats, but wanted to gain support from Southern Democrats. Kansas and Nebraska territories about to apply for statehood. The U.S. was also about to begin the Transcontinental Railroad. Douglas wanted to make sure that railroad went through Chicago, which it was probably going to do anyway. But he figured this way it would kind of throw a bone to the South, so they'd vote for the transcontinental route that goes through Chicago, and also he might get some votes from Southern Democrats when he runs for president. So that is in large part what's going on there. Sorry, looking to see if there was stuff in there about bleeding Kansas. Oh, excuse me. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act leads to what we think of as bleeding Kansas, where you have a civil war in Kansas, and the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery people literally fight it out, and hundreds of people are killed in the Civil War, and it's often seen as a predecessor to the U.S. Civil War. What will eventually happen in Kansas is that the pro-slavery side is defeated by the anti-slavery side, and then they end up having a revote, and Kansas becomes a free state. Okay. All right, a new political party rises during this time period, and it's called the Know Nothing Party. Know Nothing Party. And this is talked about on page 498 in your textbook. And the Know Nothing Party is frustration toward immigrants. So this is an anti-immigrant political party. They really dislike immigrants who are Catholic, so they're especially unhappy with Irish immigrants, maybe a handful of Italian immigrants as well, but it's primarily Irish in the 1840s. But later on, it would certainly include people from other countries as well that come over in larger numbers. So the Know Nothing Party is also referred to as the Order of the Star Spangled Banner. It's a political party, primarily urban, in cities, and it opposes immigration. They harass immigrants, try to make sure they can't get jobs, and they vandalize immigrant property when they have property. When the police come to ask them what happened, who committed the violence, they tend to say, "I know nothing," hence the nickname of the party, which is kind of interesting and a little rough, isn't it? So the goal really is to have an anti-immigrant party that wants to establish a longer waiting period before immigrants can vote. And Western states tend to be much more friendly to immigrants and, let them apply for citizenship and voting, or residency is probably the better word, and voting much faster because they need the labor more. So the states where the Know Nothing Party has the most success are going to be states where there are large cities and factories. So New England states, the book mentions specifically Massachusetts, had a pretty active Know Nothing Party. So you see a lot of activity there. These guys are more likely to win local and state elections than federal elections. But they are going to be pretty active and pretty successful in some ways. The book will mention that it's pretty common in most states, especially Western states, that suffrage, the right to vote, it's really the definition of who is a citizen during this time period, because citizenship implies certain rights, and you'll see that in the Dred Scott case that we talk about here in a minute. So without citizenship, you don't have access to those rights, which is going to be all sorts of trouble for you. All right. Star Spangled Banner, Know Nothings, they harass people, prominent in the 1840s, and will last a little bit beyond that as well. The book then mentions the free labor movement, which leads to a free labor party. I think I'll make a note in here for you, just, on the off chance that you want to peek at it. So pages 498, oops, 499 through 501, discuss. So free soil, free labor, and bleeding Kansas as well. Okay, so typo. So, so the free labor movement, we had talked about that already. Their goal is to prevent the spread of slavery to the West, because they don't want black guys owning land. The Free Soil Party is very specifically about that philosophy. Now, what odd thing will happen pretty quickly, the Free Soil Party can't support a national election. They're not going to win national elections, that sort of stuff. But what will happen is the formation of another party, which is a coalition of people who oppose the spread of slavery for various reasons, that will eventually become the Republican Party. And one of the conclusions that this group of people will come to is that the country cannot permanently exist as a partly free, partly enslaved nation. That's going to have to pick one or the other. And you certainly see Abraham Lincoln express that idea when he says that our country cannot permanently exist half slave and half free. So you're going to see that as an emerging philosophy among those groups. And that'll be, most people will look at that and go, well, that's positive, even though the group's not always so positive. All right, so Know Nothing, Order the Star Spangled Banner, political party, primarily urban, harass immigrants, and trying to suppress immigration, the rights that immigrants have by extending period of citizenship required before they can apply to vote, or other rights that citizens would have. And Free Labor Movement and Free Soil Party, and then Bleeding Kansas, that civil war in Kansas is discussed very briefly on page 500 and 501. And mostly what it talks about too is how that impacted voting in favor of the Republican Party, because people are going to start to see that as the party of abolition, and you'll start to see that party gain some traction during this era. And the book is going to talk next about the Dred Scott case. So Dred Scott case is 501 to about 503. So Dred Scott was a slave who lived in Missouri, but he had lived in several free states. But his owner was an Army doctor who kept getting transferred from one base to another. And so they lived in several free states, but he lived with his owner as a slave. When he moves to Missouri, the owner dies and he gets willed to someone else, and then that guy dies and he gets willed to someone else down the line who's an abolitionist. So, he allows a Supreme Court case to be drawn up, and the court case is going to give Dred Scott his freedom. So Dred Scott says, well, maybe we can sue so everyone in the same situation as I was, a free or an enslaved person who lived in a free territory, maybe they can all gain their freedom. So that's why he sued, not for money, for freedom, but also to set a precedent for other people in similar situations. So Dred Scott is going to sue his master, essentially, who doesn't want to be his master, to gain freedom through precedent. So not every slave would have to go to court. So he sets up a court case that through appeal makes it to the Supreme Court, and his premises are one, he's lived in a free state, and he should be entitled to freedom. And really, that's it. There's not anything beyond that. So, so the Supreme Court, in considering his case, which has made it all the way up through appeals courts, the Supreme Court decides, one, should we listen to this guy at all because he's Black and therefore not a citizen, and other things that go along with that in this era. So should we even listen to this guy at all? And then two, what rights does he have? And how do we define when somebody's enslaved and when they're free? So what the court agrees to do is not listen to the case at all. So the Chief Justice, a fellow Roger Taney, will decide that it's in the best interest of everyone for Dred Scott not to gain his freedom this way. goes to the Supreme Court. The court rules that he has no standing because he's Black and therefore not a citizen. This distinction is important. They don't rule that he has no standing because he's a slave. They rule that he has no standing because he's Black. And what this does, if you're free and Black, it means that you really have no legal protections. Now, I don't know that there were a lot of free Blacks who thought, you know, I have same protections as whites and everything's going to be fine for me. But there were certain states where that was more true in certain cities. Once this is a Supreme Court ruling, that is going to take away some of those rights and going to eliminate the possibility of rights for lots of other free Blacks. The other thing this court decides, and nobody asked them this, was that no state really has the right to limit slavery in any way. So that negates Missouri Compromise, Kansas, Nebraska, Compromise of 1850, negates any federal or state law that prohibits slavery. Now, as you can imagine, nobody wants to deal with that. So that part of the ruling is kind of ignored because they don't know what to do with that. And that could turn into a civil war pretty quickly, which everyone's been trying to avoid for 20 years. But in the 50s, much more specifically, though they've been, trying to avoid a conflict before that. Now they know what the conflict is going to be, and nobody wants to be in charge when that happens. So, Dred Scott ruling says that Blacks are not eligible for citizenship. Also says that no state can limit slavery. Incredibly important ruling. This is, I'm sorry, I didn't put the date in there. I feel like it's 57. The opinion of it. Yep, 57. Okay. I should probably put that in parentheses, so we'll have that for later. All right. So this is going to create some turmoil within the United States. Excuse me. And then we'd had some turmoil already. We probably need to go back at some point and talk about more of the turmoil. I don't know that today will be the day, but tomorrow might be. Also, I think I've mentioned this before, but this week we only have 3 chapters, so we have the 4 class days. So we should be able to go over all this stuff and then review things. We should have plenty of time to do stuff this week. All right. So there's this dude, John Brown. And John Brown, who's like an interesting, weird, noble, scary, he's all kinds of things, dude. John Brown is convinced that God talks to him, usually in the forest, which is kind of weird in the United States because people sort of grew up skeptical of the forest and thinking, you know, in the old colonial days, like Puritan days, like way back days, people seem to think that the demons lived in the forest. So like old school Puritans would never go to the forest because they thought a demon would get them or something. They were kind of funny about that. But John Brown is pretty sure you wander around in the forest and God will talk to you directly. And God told John Brown some interesting things. One thing that God told John Brown, God was telling other folks like, we talked about before, Theodore Well, that slavery is a sin. When John Brown was a little kid, he believed this as well. And I think he and his family, I forget where they lived. I want to say it was Ohio, but it could have been New York, worked to free slaves. I think he saved money as a kid to help pay off a slave's price or debt so the slave could be freed. So he's fought this for pretty much his whole, the whole time he's had any sort of spiritual awareness that God has told him slavery is a sin. He also believes later on that God is telling him that God will use him to end slavery in the United States. So during Bleeding Kansas, John Brown has like 20 kids. That's a lot of kids. So John Brown's biggest problem in life, probably most of his life, is that he's broke. And I just told you why he's broke. He's got 20 kids. I mean, he's not particularly successful as a farmer. You know, he's just one of those small farmers that's just barely making it, but 20 kids, dang, that's a lot of. Some of his kids moved to Kansas during the Civil War, during the Bleeding Kansas, Bloody Kansas episode, and they get involved in the Pottawatomie and Osawatomie Creek massacres, where some pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces attack each other. Initially, it's the pro-slavery forces that attack the anti-slavery forces and are pretty successful. You know, they raid their camps. A couple of John Brown's kids got killed. I think one gets killed, one gets injured. And then John Brown moves to Kansas to hang out with his sons and kind of teach them some fighting techniques. So he is going to lead a raid on Osawatomie Creek, where they end up killing some slave owners and their family. And it's pretty bloody stuff. I've read some sources, and I'm not sure all the sources about John Brown are reliable, because he's going to sell his story and it's going to be, you know, exaggerated for effect, that sort of stuff. He doesn't I shouldn't say he sells his story. He doesn't sell it. He's going to tell his story so that it's published pretty often, because, you know, he believes that his story and his life are going to be used to end slavery. So he wants to make sure people know about him and know about the fighting in Kansas. But you know, I read some sources where when he and his sons attacked some slave owning families, that they cut up some of the bodies and send the parts to different parts of the state as a message. It's a fairly biblical, weird, sort of odd thing that is done, not very often, but from time to time, to send a message. So John Brown is a pretty vicious dude. I'm sure you do appreciate his cause, but his tactics are pretty rough. And he's going to deny those things, you know, in his story, because he really wants to come off as a man called by God, and people would not be super comfortable with that. However, he is going to lead a raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and the goal here is to gain a federal arsenal. And he goes along with, I think it's 19 other folks, a lot of freed slaves, a couple of his kids. Remember, he's got a lot of kids. So they're going to go to seize a federal arsenal and share those weapons with other freed slaves and current slaves, and then lead a general slave rebellion, kind of Nat Turner style, but with many more weapons. Well, he plans it at Frederick Douglass's house, and he asked Frederick Douglass, "Hey, do you want to come?" And Frederick Douglass says no, because it's fairly clear there's a very good chance, almost 100%, that they are going to get caught. And if you get caught raiding a federal arsenal and trying to lead a rebellion, that's treason. You're going to die. And Frederick Douglass's thought was he was more valuable to the cause of abolition if he was alive. John Brown's thought apparently was he might be more valuable dead. So I'm not sure that he shared that thought with everybody who signed up with him, because I think they probably thought they were going to it was possible they would have a successful raid. They did not, and they get captured, some killed, you know, in combat, but they get captured and put on trial, and John Brown is put on trial, and he's going to be found guilty of treason. I can't remember if they have quotes from John Brown in here. Yep. So they let him give a speech after he's convicted, and he writes a letter as well that has these same words in it. And John Brown's speech and letters are pretty, you know, Old Testament-y, but he says, "I, John Brown, am quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. So he's saying that the only way that slavery ends is with a war. He's also making a biblical allusion to the Old Testament need for sacrifice, that sort of stuff, and the blood of animals to cover sins and that sort of thing, propitiation, that kind of thing. But yeah, but he is the importance of John Brown's argument here and discussion and actions in Kansas and Harper's Ferry. And this happens in, let's see, October of 59. So the trial will be pretty quickly in 59 and early 1960, which is an election, 1960, 1860, which is the election year for Abraham Lincoln. So what this does is it forces people to have a discussion, abolitionists to have a discussion about whether or not violence is an appropriate and effective technique in ending slavery. Now, most of the transcendental kind of the Henry David Thoreaus and Emersons of the world were pacifists. They did not think violence was okay. What John Brown's actions do are push those guys from the belief that violence is never acceptable to the belief that in certain instances, violence may be the only thing that works. So the actions of John Brown push a very public discussion about the use of violence to end slavery, whether that's appropriate or not. And it leads to a conclusion that fighting a war to end slavery would truly be a just war and would be an acceptable type of war to have. Now, the Republican Party that's newly formed with that coalition of people that dislike slavery, they're not going to take an official position on that. And certainly Abraham Lincoln's quotes will be very Abraham Lincoln-like, something like, while we all have to admire his cause, we need to be cautious about his methods, that sort of thing. Because, nobody really wants to start a civil war. And certainly even people who think slavery is a sin, also probably think murder is a sin. So they're trying to reconcile, is this really murder or is this defense of someone else's life? And, what they'll eventually conclude is it's defense of someone else's life. So central issues to the newly formed Republican Party, and we will definitely go back and look at the election of 1860 next time we talk. But the Republicans going to be the new party that forms as the Whigs dissolve. The Whigs, the anti-Jackson group, since Jackson's not there anymore, that issue doesn't allow them to coalesce. And the Whigs are going to split into anti and pro-slavery Whigs. So the Republican Party is going to be a coalition of people who don't want to see the spread of slavery or would like to see the end of slavery. So it could include some free soilers, and it's going to include conscience Whigs, and then it's going to include abolitionists. So lots of people who think slavery should not spread. Not everybody in there agrees why slavery shouldn't spread. Most people in that party do not think blacks and whites are equal. There are going to be a handful of them that do, and most of the more prominent abolitionists do believe in immediate abolition, and that freed blacks are deserving of rights, whether they believe they're completely equal, mostly equal, that sort of thing. There's a spectrum, but they definitely believe they're deserving of citizenship and rights. But that again that's probably not the majority of anybody. There are going to be a lot of people, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about the Civil War, who are going to oppose the South because it's the South and they live in the North. So, all right. Central issues of the Republican Party, really that slavery should not spread or that slavery should end. So immediate causes of the Civil War. I'm just not one of those that thinks it's tariffs, but certainly control of the government. You know, does the North believe the South has too much? Does the South believe the North has too much? But slavery, the Dred Scott case, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, and then when Lincoln pledges to end slavery as part of his presidency and runs for the presidency, most of the Southern states, and if you didn't know this before last year, you know it now, states control election policy in their state. So they determine how somebody gets on the ballot, how you register, how long the voting lasts, where it, you know, where it happens, that sort of thing. We probably have that ingrained in our minds now after lots of recent political discussion. But the Southern states all made, you know, through their rules process, made sure that Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans were not on the ballot in the South. So when they had the election in 1860, they could say, you didn't get votes in the South, you're not our president. So when Lincoln ends up winning the election, the South is going to say, we didn't vote for you, you're not our president. So the election of Lincoln as president, who pledged to stop the spread of slavery, and the South will not recognize his election as legitimate. So they're going to try to nullify, that's their thing. You know, like the nullification crisis over the 1828 tariff, they're going to try to essentially nullify this election and then withdraw from the Union. So, and there were Southern states who said, if Lincoln gets elected, then we're seceding, we're out. And they did do that. So the election of Abraham Lincoln will stop the spread, as a promise to stop the spread of slavery, is going to be problematic for Southern states. And he gets elected without a single electoral vote from the South, so he's not their president. And then the Southern states start to secede in the period between the election and when Lincoln takes office. And then they seized a federal fort at the end of Buchanan's presidency, and Buchanan just said, I'm not dealing with that. When Lincoln becomes president, he's inaugurated, he says, you know what, we can't just let him take over a federal fort. At the very least, let's go make sure they have enough supplies. Now, he knows that when he sends troops there with supplies, they're going to get shot at. But once they get shot at, then he can say, look, they fired first, they started it, we have to finish it. Not a direct quote, of course. All right, I'm going to stop and also probably check the roll. So let me